Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Garrett had always considered himself a lucky man. He'd built his tech consulting firm from the ground up, turning an idea born in his garage into a thriving business that employed 43 people. The house he lived in, a sleek two-story home with natural stone finishes and large glass windows, had been bought with the sweat of years of hard work, long before he ever met Melissa. It was his sanctuary, his personal trophy, tangible proof that sacrifice and dedication paid off. When he married Melissa 4 years ago, he thought he'd finally completed the puzzle of his life. She was vibrant, sociable, always eager to host dinners for clients and business partners. She didn't work outside the home, preferring instead to manage the house and, as she often put it, support his career behind the scenes. Patrick, his business partner, had been essential to that success. They'd met in college, shared the same ambitious dreams, and built the company together. Patrick handled sales and strategic partnerships while Garrett focused on technical development and operations. Their division of responsibilities worked perfectly. They trusted each other completely. Patrick visited his house regularly, joined weekend barbecues, and was practically family. Melissa and Patrick chatted easily, exchanged jokes, and seemed to get along like in-laws who never quarreled. Garrett saw this as harmony, proof that he'd chosen well, both in his partner and his wife. Business trips were part of the routine. 2 or 3 times a month, Garrett flew to other cities, pitched proposals to major corporations, and closed deals that kept the company growing. Melissa never complained. She said she understood those absences were temporary, necessary, the price of success. She always sent him off with warm kisses and caring messages during his time away. There had never been any reason to suspect anything. No visible red flags. Or at least, Garrett hadn't noticed them, until his front neighbor, a retired man named Harold, rang his doorbell on a Tuesday afternoon. Harold was discreet and polite, the kind of neighbor who'd wave from a distance but rarely struck up long conversations. So Garrett was surprised to see him standing in the doorway, looking hesitant, his hands tucked into the pockets of the gray wool vest he always wore. Harold explained he was planning to install security cameras on his property. The neighborhood had seen a few recent break-ins, not serious, but enough to worry him. The issue was that, given his house's angle, the cameras would inevitably capture part of Garrett's driveway and front entrance. He wanted permission, wanted to avoid any misunderstanding. Garrett laughed, patted Harold on the shoulder, and said it wasn't a problem at all. Security mattered. If the cameras helped protect the neighborhood, great. Harold thanked him with visible relief and left. Garrett forgot about it entirely. 2 weeks passed. Garrett was returning from a 3-day trip, tired but satisfied after closing a significant contract with a logistics company. He parked in the garage, pulled his suitcase from the trunk, and walked inside. Melissa was in the kitchen making a snack, smiled when she saw him, and asked how the trip went. Everything was normal. Perfectly normal. It wasn't until the next day, when Harold showed up at his door again, that reality began to crumble. This time, the neighbor wasn't smiling. He held a small USB drive between his fingers and wore a grave, almost anguished expression. He said he needed to show Garrett something caught on his newly installed security footage. Something that had kept him awake all night, debating whether or not to get involved. They sat in the living room. Harold plugged the USB drive into Garrett's laptop and opened a series of video files. All were time-stamped at night, all from the past 15 days. The first video showed Garrett's garage lit only by the street lamp. The clock read 11:42 p.m. Then a far too familiar car entered the frame. It was Patrick's silver sedan. Garrett felt a strange pang in his chest, a twinge of confusion. Patrick parked in the garage as if it were his own home. The front door opened, and Melissa appeared, wearing a short robe Garrett recognized immediately. She smiled. Patrick smiled. They embraced in a way that left no doubt. It wasn't a friendly hug. It was lovers' embrace. They walked inside together, and the door closed. Harold fast-forwarded to other clips. Same scene, different dates. Always during Garrett's business trips. Patrick arriving late at night, Melissa opening the door, the two of them going in together. In one video, Patrick didn't leave until 6 in the morning, glancing around before getting into his car and driving off. In another, Melissa followed him out barefoot and kissed him deeply before saying goodbye. Garrett watched it all in silence. He didn't feel immediate anger. He felt a hollow emptiness, as if someone had ripped out his insides and left only a shell. Harold mumbled an apology, saying he didn't know whether he should interfere but couldn't live with himself knowing and staying silent. Garrett thanked him in a mechanical voice and asked for a copy of the footage. Harold transferred everything to another USB drive he'd prepared just in case. After Harold left, Garrett sat alone in the living room for nearly an hour, watching and rewatching the videos. He counted the dates. Patrick had been in his home, with his wife, at least 7 times in 2 weeks. Probably more, before the cameras were installed. How long had this been going on? Months? Years? Garrett thought of all the barbecues, all the business gatherings where both Patrick and Melissa had been present, all the times he'd traveled trusting everything was safe at home. The betrayal was twofold. It wasn't just his wife. It was his best friend, his business partner, the man he trusted with half his company and with whom he shared the profits from every contract. The pain began to shift into something colder, more calculated. Garrett wasn't a man of emotional outbursts. He was a strategist. He'd built an entire company by planning every move with precision. So he'd plan this too. He grabbed his phone and sent a message to the entire team, calling a mandatory all-hands meeting for the next morning at 9 sharp. Reason: important announcement. No one questioned it. Garrett never scheduled all-hands meetings without serious cause. Then he spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. He connected his laptop to the conference room projector and tested the videos to ensure they'd play flawlessly. Every detail mattered. At dinner, Melissa asked about the meeting. Garrett lied with surprising ease, saying it was just a quarterly results presentation, nothing major. She seemed to believe him, changed the subject, and talked about a new recipe she wanted to try. Garrett chewed his food without tasting it. He looked at the woman sitting across from him and saw a stranger. 4 years of marriage, 4 years of lies. How many times had she slept with Patrick in the bed they shared? How many times had she looked him in the eye and lied about where she'd been, what she'd done, who she'd been with? The coldness in his chest grew. It wasn't anger. It was absolute determination. The next morning, Garrett arrived early at the office. The conference room was already set up. Employees trickled in, chatting about the mysterious meeting, speculating about new projects or possible organizational changes. Patrick arrived 15 minutes early, as always, shook Garrett's hand firmly, and greeted him with a confident smile. He asked what the meeting was about. Garrett smiled back and said it was a surprise, everyone needed to be present. Patrick shrugged, poured himself some coffee, and went to chat with colleagues. There was no visible tension. No suspicion. Patrick had no idea what was coming. At 9 o'clock, all 43 employees were seated. Garrett closed the conference room door, asked everyone to sit, and dimmed the light slightly. He said he had something important to show them, something that would change the company's structure. He connected his laptop to the projector. The large screen on the wall lit up. And then, without warning or preamble, the videos began to play. Patrick's silver sedan pulling into Garrett's garage. Melissa opening the front door. Their embrace. Their kiss. The two of them walking inside together. The timestamp made it clear, it was nighttime, on days when Garrett had been traveling. The silence in the room was instant and absolute. 43 people watched, mouths agape, incredulous. Garrett let 3 different clips play in full. Different dates, same scene. Patrick tried to stand up, his face turning red, his voice starting to choke out a protest, but Garrett spoke first, his calm, controlled voice cutting off any attempt at explanation. He said only this: "As you can see, my partner has been making very personal use of my business trips. But don't worry, that's not all he's been doing behind my back." Patrick went pale. He stumbled to his feet, muttered something unintelligible, and practically ran out of the room, knocking over chairs as he went. The door slammed shut behind him. No one moved. All eyes turned back to Garrett. Garrett continued as if nothing had happened. He announced that, in light of these personal discoveries, he'd ordered an immediate and thorough audit of all the company's accounts and financial operations. He'd hired an external forensic auditing firm, and they'd begin that same afternoon. Anyone with relevant information about irregularities should speak to him privately. The meeting was over. People filed out slowly, whispering to each other, stunned. Some of the longer-tenured employees, those who'd known Patrick for years, looked especially shaken. Patrick's secretary had tears in her eyes. Garrett returned to his office and closed the door. The audit began immediately. The firm he'd hired had an impeccable reputation and a team experienced in uncovering corporate fraud. It took just 3 days. 3 days to unearth what Patrick had so carefully hidden. Systematic embezzlement, phantom contracts, commissions rerouted to personal accounts. Patrick had woven an elaborate web of small transactions that, when added up, amounted to significant sums. Forged documents, falsified signatures, a sophisticated fraud operation he'd been running for at least 18 months. The stolen amount exceeded $200,000. It was a federal crime. It meant certain jail time. Garrett turned everything over to the police. He filed a formal complaint and provided all documents and evidence. 2 detectives showed up at Patrick's office 4 days after the meeting. Patrick was handcuffed in front of his remaining colleagues and taken into custody while shouting that he could explain, that it was all a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. The numbers didn't lie. The evidence was irrefutable. Patrick was charged with embezzlement, document forgery, and corporate fraud. Bail was denied due to flight risk. He was held in county jail awaiting trial. During those chaotic days at the office, Garrett barely returned home. When he finally found time to deal with the second half of his shattered life, it was Friday afternoon. He called Melissa from his office. She answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful as she asked if he'd be home early for dinner. Garrett said only one sentence: "I need you to wait for me at home. I'll be there in an hour. Don't leave." Something in his tone made Melissa stammer a nervous agreement. He hung up. The house was quiet when Garrett walked in. Melissa sat on the living room sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, tense but still trying to maintain some composure. Garrett didn't sit. He stood, pulled the USB drive from his pocket, and plugged it into the living room TV. Without a word, he played the same videos he'd shown at the office. Melissa watched the first few seconds before bursting into tears, covering her face with her hands and murmuring, "No, no, no," like a desperate mantra. When the video ended, Garrett finally spoke. His voice came out oddly calm, almost clinical. "How long, Melissa? How long have you been sleeping with my partner in my own house, in my own bed, while I was away working to pay for all of this?" She tried to respond, words tumbling out in a jumble, offering pathetic excuses about loneliness, about him traveling too much, about Patrick being attentive when she felt abandoned. Garrett cut her off with a wave of his hand. He didn't want to hear justifications. There were none possible. He continued methodically, almost as if delivering a business presentation. He informed her he'd consulted a family law attorney. Divorce papers were already being prepared. The house they were in, purchased by him years before their marriage, was his sole property. There was no marital estate to divide. Melissa wouldn't be entitled to anything. She tried to argue, saying she needed time to get organized, that she had nowhere to go. Garrett pulled an envelope from his suit jacket and tossed it onto the coffee table. Inside were the completed divorce papers and a modest check, enough for her to rent something temporary. You have until Sunday to take your personal belongings. Clothes, sentimental items, only what's strictly yours. Whatever you leave behind stays here. Monday morning, the locks will be changed. If you're still here, I'll call the police for trespassing. Garrett's voice was relentless. Melissa dropped to her knees, begging, crying, saying she'd made a terrible mistake, that she regretted it, that she loved him. But Garrett wasn't listening anymore. He turned and walked upstairs to the guest bedroom, where he'd spend the weekend locked away while she packed. Melissa knocked on the guest room door several times over the next 48 hours. Garrett never answered. On Sunday night, when he finally came out, the house was empty. She'd taken her clothes, some books, a few photographs. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Garrett picked up the small gold band and tossed it in the trash without ceremony. The following months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. The divorce moved quickly, eased by the lack of real joint assets and the absence of children. Melissa tried to contest it, claiming she deserved compensation for having taken care of the house for 4 years, but no judge took that argument seriously given the evidence of infidelity and the fact that the house was Garrett's prenuptial property. The divorce was finalized in less than 4 months. Patrick's criminal case took longer. The fraud evidence was overwhelming. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Garrett rejected any proposal that didn't include significant prison time. In the end, Patrick was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for corporate fraud and embezzlement. He'd have to repay all the stolen money plus hefty fines. His career was ruined. His reputation was destroyed. News of the case spread through the tech industry, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust in business partners. Garrett took full control of the company. He restructured operations, hired a carefully vetted new sales director, and implemented stricter financial controls. Curiously, many employees became even more loyal after the scandal. They respected how he'd handled everything, without hysteria, without unnecessary public drama, just calculated, efficient moves. The company didn't just survive, it grew. New contracts were signed. Revenue increased. Garrett proved he could thrive on his own, without a deceitful partner or an unfaithful wife draining his energy. Melissa tried reaching out a few times over the following months, text messages apologizing, long emails explaining her regret. Garrett blocked all her numbers and filtered her emails. He had no interest in reconciliation, conversation, or closure. For him, that chapter had closed the moment he'd played those videos in the conference room. He later heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another state, lived in a small apartment, and worked at a department store. The fall from comfort to harsh financial reality had been brutal for someone who'd never worried about money. Patrick lost everything in prison. His wife, the one who'd never known about the affair, filed for divorce as soon as the truth came out. His children stopped visiting. The house was sold to cover legal debts and restitution. He'd eventually get out of prison, but he'd emerge as a marked man, with a criminal record that would make it nearly impossible to land a decent job again. The arrogance with which he'd betrayed his best friend and stolen from their company had cost him literally everything he had. 8 months after the divorce, Garrett was on his home terrace on a Saturday afternoon. He'd hired a landscaper to redo the garden, erasing any visual memories of his time with Melissa. New furniture, new decor, everything chosen by him alone, reflecting his tastes without compromise. He held a glass of wine and watched the sunset when his phone rang. It was Harold, the neighbor. They chatted briefly. Harold asked how Garrett was doing and said he was glad to see he'd moved past everything with such dignity. Garrett thanked him again for having the courage to show him the footage. Without it, he might still be getting betrayed, still paying for his unfaithful wife's lifestyle and still losing money to a corrupt partner. Harold chuckled softly and said that sometimes the worst news is really the best news in disguise. Garrett hung up and thought about that. In a way, installing those cameras had been the best thing that could have happened. It revealed truths that needed to come to light. Yes, it hurt. Yes, it destroyed relationships he'd believed were solid. But it also set him free, free from a false marriage, from a toxic partnership, from people who'd never truly respected him. He was alone now, but it was an honest solitude, not the false companionship of traitors. 3 months later, he ran into Melissa by chance at a supermarket. She was in the checkout line, pushing a cart with basic groceries, visibly worn down. The hair she'd always kept impeccably styled at expensive salons was now longer and obviously hadn't seen a professional cut. Her clothes were simple and functional, nothing like the luxury brands she used to wear. She saw him first. Froze. Garrett simply gave her a brief, polite nod, the kind he'd offer any vague acquaintance. There was no anger in the gesture. No bitterness. Nothing at all. She was just a shadow of a past he'd already processed and filed away. Melissa tried to approach, but Garrett was already turning down an aisle, disappearing between the shelves. There was nothing left to say. No conversation could undo what had happened. No explanation could make betrayal acceptable. She'd made her choices. He'd made his. The consequences had been fairly distributed. Garrett left the supermarket, loaded his groceries into the trunk, and drove back home. His home. His name on the deed. His space. He thought about how drastically life can change because of tiny details, a security camera installed at just the right angle, a neighbor with enough conscience to do the right thing, 2 weeks of footage that exposed years of lies. That night, he sat in his home office reviewing expansion plans for the business, new markets, new opportunities. He was considering opening a branch in another city, maybe hiring a team specialized in artificial intelligence. The business had enormous potential. He had renewed energy. No more emotional distractions. No more doubts about who to trust professionally. He'd learned to be more selective, more cautious, but not cynical. He still believed good people existed. He just knew now that not everyone who smiles is a friend, and not everyone who shares your bed shares your honor. Patrick would serve his sentence and eventually get out, but Garrett would never think of him as anything more than a corrected judgment error. Melissa would rebuild her life somehow, but without the comfort she'd taken for granted. They'd both carry the scars of their choices. Garrett had scars too, but they were the kind that strengthened rather than weakened. They proved he could survive devastating betrayals and emerge stronger, more focused, and more successful. He closed his laptop, turned off the office lights, and headed upstairs to bed. Before sleeping, he looked out the window at the quiet street. Across the way, Harold's house still had its lights on. The security cameras, tiny electronic eyes watching over the neighborhood, kept recording. Kept documenting. Kept revealing truths that needed to be seen. Garrett smiled faintly. Sometimes the right technology at the right moment changes everything. Sometimes the perfect angle captures more than just images, it captures destinies being redefined. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.